Hi, my name is Vicki Case, and I'm going to share with you about the research that I did this semester on literacy instruction in the elementary level. I wanted to look and see which might be best, structured literacy or balanced literacy. So as you might know from your reading instruction really has swung back and forth many times over from the phonics-based or structured literacy to meaning-based, or what we might know as whole language. And it's gone back and forth many times to full extremes. Well, lately, educational experts in the past couple decades have been trying to balance that between the two and calling it balanced literacy. So let's look and see how our students are scoring. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, their report card of 2019 says that 35% of the nation's fourth graders scored at the proficient level or higher, meaning we have a lot of students who are struggling to read, and in fact this was 1% lower than in 2017 score. Here in Kansas, in the Department of Education, state assessments shows that 35% of the fourth graders in 2019 scored a 2, which means they have basic ability and their post-secondary readiness is at a 2 level, and 17% earned a 1, which means they have limited ability in reading language arts and their post-secondary readiness, meaning we have a lot of students, even here in Kansas, who are still struggling to read. So let's look at these three approaches. Structured literacy is a systematic, explicit approach to reading, focusing on phonemic awareness, alphabetic principles, decoding, syllabication, and morphology, whereas whole language is an approach where students learn to read just by being immersed in high-quality literature and literacy environment. And balanced literacy, of course, tries to balance those things, so it's a focused approach on using shared reading, read-alouds, guided readings, independent reading, as well as guided and independent writing. So when I look at the framework behind the structured and the balanced literacy, I see kind of two extremes. Structured literacy is founded in behaviorism, where changes are observable, such as seeing reading skills develop. And when I started researching this, I noticed that it tied in really well to Edward Thorndike's laws. Three of them, specifically his law of readiness, meaning that we work from easy to more complex, his law of identical elements, meaning that the tasks build upon each other as we learn, and then finally the law of exercising, meaning we need to practice it. And that fits in really well with structured literacy. It fits all of those characteristics. I also looked at Philip Go's information processing model, which is a bottom-up model where those cognitive processes go from lower to higher, such as we recognize that printed text patterns, connect it to sounds, which then connects to words, and then finally to meaning within sentences. Whereas constructivism is more of a top-down approach, allowing students to construct their meaning from their knowledge, and it ties in with that psycholinguistic theory, using some cueing systems of syntactic, semantic, and graphic phonic cues. So we're looking for those cues in reading to help us read rather than really focusing on the letters and letter sounds. And it's taught through experiences rather than a more systematic approach. So what does the research say? When I did my research, some of the things that I found was that it can be really challenging, really understanding even what teachers believe about instruction compared to what they're implementing in their instruction. In one study, they invited hundreds of teachers to complete surveys about their reading instruction, what they perceived, what they actually did, and in fact they completed that the TORP study like many of us have done in another class. And they found that most of the teachers fit into that middle, that balanced or skills approach versus the phonics or the whole language. But then when they looked at what their actual implementation was, many of them really were focused in that balanced area of lots of guided reading, lots of independent reading. But when they dug a little further, they even found that it was dependent on the grade level taught. So those primary level teachers in the study were maybe focusing more on those phonemic awareness and phonics, whereas the intermediate level elementary teachers might be more towards that balanced literacy or guided reading instruction. But overall, I found in my study and research that for teaching children to read, structured literacy really is best. You know, there are some students who will learn to read regardless of what approach you use. But there's some of those students who really need that explicit instruction, and we really don't want to make any assumptions on how they might learn to read and make sure they get the instruction that they need. So a real guiding study that I looked at was the National Reading Panel of 2000, and they reported that instruction in reading should include that explicit instruction in phonemic awareness and phonics, especially for those primary grade students as well as the at-risk students. And so these things were key. I also looked at some specific studies. One was in a district up in the Pacific Northwest where they took all their elementary schools and half of them used a more structured literacy approach using a direct instruct model that was their experimental group, and then the rest of the schools used their current balanced literacy. It was a quantitative study over 3 years, and they found that by and far, even in all subgroups, the students gained more from that structured literacy. In fact, all of the students scored over the 50th percentile, whereas those students using the balanced literacy on average scored below the 50th percentile in their reading tests. In Texas, there was more of a qualitative study looking at the implementation of a balanced literacy program in a school district. And when they covered a couple years, the teachers in their qualitative study felt like the students didn't gain or grow from that balanced literacy program versus maybe some things that they had used in the past. It also showed me in the research that professional development and instruction in both in our pre-service as well as ongoing professional development is critical for success for those students. Many teachers really don't have the adequate training to teach structured literacy, and they need those opportunities even for ongoing mentoring. So when we think about implementing in a balanced literacy classroom, typically there's many kinds of reading activities, but phonics are probably, even though they say it's included, are probably embedded in the instruction. Maybe during guided reading, students might be looking for words that have the ch sound, or they're looking for words that begin with the p sound, and then they decode that way. And it's more of a whole to part view of looking for things. They're using those multiple cueing systems rather than decoding. And like I said, this may work for some, and it may be more beneficial for those older learners who are able to decode and they are fluent readers. Whereas those younger students, they need that structured literacy really to teach them how to read, focusing on phonemic awareness and phonics, the focus on those letters and sounds rather than guessing. General spelling patterns, not rules, are taught because we all know that there is an exception to almost every rule that maybe we've learned. Begins with those easiest concepts and gets more complex, teaching that part to whole in the decoding. And probably one of the key factors in this structured literacy is using decodable texts so that students can apply what they are learning and practice with that repeated reading. Some of the implications when we look at this is that we want to make sure we're building those skills and finding meaning once they have fluency. And it allows the students to shift that cognitive load of decoding, and they're getting fluent, to the comprehension. Now, it should not be taught in isolation. In fact, much of the time should be spent reading connected text. As I mentioned before, it benefits primary students, at-risk students as well. And in fact, one study showed that the mean effect sizes for at-risk students was 0.86, which is incredibly high, and that growth measure continued to follow them. Another group of students that they found was really good was for those students that were dyslexic, and their study showed that they also gained from this kind of instruction. So when we look at it in the end, I really found that there's no one approach that is best for all students. For young learners and at-risk learners, a structured literacy approach is the best. When we get to the students a little older, then that balanced literacy approach maybe becomes more apropos. But we're teaching students, those young learners, to read. The systematic approach really is best. I have included my references as well in my PowerPoint presentation, which I will share, so if you want to do any further research. Thanks so much.